What is the true value of a person? Is it found on a balance sheet, a resume, a title etched on a frosted glass door? Or is it found in the quiet moments no one sees, in the spaces between the spreadsheets and the quarterly reports? We are taught to measure worth in assets, in influence, in the roar of success. But sometimes the most valuable asset in the entire world is the one that is utterly invisible. This is a story about a woman who was invisible, and a man who was taught to see only in numbers, and how they discovered a currency more valuable than gold. Alara Vance lived a life of quiet repetition, a ghost haunting the periphery of power. By day, she was a low-level data entry clerk for a third-party contractor, her fingers dancing across a keyboard in a windowless room in the sub-basement of the gleaming Thorn Industries tower. By night, she wore a different uniform, that of a cleaner, her cart squeaking softly through the deserted, opulent halls of the very same building. The two jobs bled into one another, a gray continuum of service and anonymity, all to pay down the mountain of medical debt her mother's long illness had left behind. Alara was a creature of patterns. She saw them everywhere, in the precise grid of the ceiling tiles, in the cadence of the security guard's cough, and most of all, in the river of data that flowed through the building's digital veins. While her colleagues saw numbers, Alara saw music. She saw rhythms, harmonies, and, sometimes, a jarring note of dissonance. Tonight, as she wiped down the glass walls of the main server room, she felt it again. A flicker on a monitor, a pulse that was out of sync with the building's thrumming heartbeat. It was a tiny, insignificant tremor, a millisecond of lag in a petabyte of information. Anyone else would have missed it. But to Alara, it was like a scratch on a perfect record, a single sour note in a symphony. She paused, her rag hovering over the glass, and her eyes traced the flow of light on the screen. It was wrong. Something was fundamentally wrong. Far above her, on the 80th floor, Julian Thorn stood silhouetted against a panoramic window that displayed the city like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He was the CEO, the inheritor of a corporate empire, a man the press had dubbed the Ice King for his cold, analytical precision. But tonight, the ice was cracking. The landmark merger with Omnicorp, the deal that was meant to be his legacy, the one that would finally move him out of his legendary father's shadow, was collapsing. Billions of dollars were vanishing into thin air, projections were failing, and his hand-picked team of the world's best analysts couldn't find the leak. They were drowning, and no one knew why. He felt the ghost of his father in the room, a silent, judging presence. Failure was not an option in the Thorn dynasty. It was an erasure. The weight of it was a physical pressure on his chest, a cold dread that the city lights could not warm. He was surrounded by the best minds money could buy, yet he had never felt more alone, more utterly lost in a storm of his own making. The crisis had reached a fever pitch. The Omnicorp deal was hemorrhaging value with every passing hour. Marcus Vance, Julian's ambitious and slick senior vice president, stood before him, radiating a confidence that felt both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "My team is running a full diagnostic, Julian," Marcus said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "It's a complex market fluctuation, a ghost in the machine. We'll isolate it." "We always do," but Julian had heard the same assurances for a week, and with each one, the company bled a little more. He saw a flicker of something in Marcus's eyes. Not concern, but anticipation. It was a look Julian knew well, the look of a predator waiting for the king of the pride to show a sign of weakness. Dismissing him with a curt nod, Julian turned back to the wall of monitors in his office, a god's-eye view of his empire. He had access to everything, from global financial feeds to the low-level security cameras in the sub-basements. In his desperation, he started clicking through them, a futile search for anything, any anomaly his experts might have missed. He scanned the empty boardrooms, the silent trading floors, the deserted hallways. And then he stopped. Camera 7B, the sub-level server room. A cleaner stood there, her back to the camera. But she wasn't cleaning. She was perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a diagnostic monitor. He watched, intrigued, as her hand lifted, her finger tracing an invisible, complex shape in the air. It wasn't a random gesture. It was deliberate, analytical. She was following a path, a pattern only she could see. He zoomed in, the grainy image sharpening. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her face. But in that moment, in the sterile, fluorescent glare of the server room, Julian Thorne saw the first thing that had made sense to him all week. He saw a focus so intense it was almost a physical force, a mind at work in a place he never would have thought to look. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. Security. Find the cleaner in the sublevel server room. Bring her to my office. Now the summons came like a thunderclap. 2 imposing security guards found Alara in a supply closet, carefully measuring disinfectant. They didn't explain. They simply said, "Mr. Thorne wants to see you." The journey to the 80th floor was a silent, terrifying ascent. The elevator rose through the building's strata, from the concrete and steel of her world to the glass and chrome of his. When the doors opened, she stepped into an office so vast and quiet it felt like a cathedral dedicated to money. And there he was, Julian Thorne, standing by the window, a figure of immense and intimidating power. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was sure she was being fired, though she couldn't imagine what she had done. "You were in the server room," he said, his voice calm and dangerously quiet. He didn't turn around. "You were watching the monitors." Alara's own voice was a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just cleaning the glass. I didn't touch anything." "You traced a pattern in the air?" he continued, finally turning to face her. His eyes were piercing, analytical, stripping away her defenses. "What did you see?" She swallowed hard, the worn fabric of her uniform suddenly feeling thin and inadequate. How could she explain it? How could she describe the discordant note she had perceived in the river of light? I don't know, sir. It's just a feeling. The flow is wrong. There's a stutter. An echo where it should be smooth." She knew how insane it sounded. She was a cleaner, not an analyst. She was speaking about feelings in a world of facts. At that moment, another man stepped out of a connecting office. He was impeccably dressed, with a kind but weary face. This was David Chun, Julian's chief counsel and oldest friend. "Julian," David said softly, his eyes flicking from Julian to the terrified cleaner. "What is this? We have the board on a conference call in 10 minutes." Julian ignored him, his focus entirely on Alara. "An echo?" he repeated, a strange light dawning in his eyes. He had spent a fortune on analysts who gave him complex reports and indecipherable charts. This woman, with her simple, poetic words, had just described the problem more accurately than any of them. He was staking his legacy on a failing merger, and the only person speaking a language that made sense was the one who cleaned his floors. "I want you to look at the data," Julian said, the decision solidifying in his mind with terrifying speed. "All of it." David Chun stepped forward, aghast. "Julian, be reasonable. This is a multi-billion-dollar crisis. You can't just—" "She sees something we don't." "David." Julian cut him off, his voice absolute. He looked at Alara, whose face was a mask of disbelief. "I will pay you 10 times your current salary. You will work with me directly. You will have access to everything." "Find the echo." Alara stared at him, speechless. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the fumes of cleaning chemicals. But the look in Julian Thorne's eyes was not a dream. It was the desperate, focused gaze of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. And against every instinct for survival that told her to run, to hide, to remain invisible, she heard herself say a single life-altering word. "Okay." Walking into the Thorne Industries boardroom the next day was like stepping onto another planet. Alara wore her best clothes. A simple, dark dress and a coat that, while clean, was visibly worn at the cuffs. She clutched the strap of her worn handbag as if it were an anchor in a storm. The room was a sea of bespoke suits and $1,000 watches. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and quiet, predatory ambition. At the head of the long, polished table sat Julian Thorne, an island of calm in the tense silence. To his right was Marcus Vance, who looked at Alara as if she were a particularly unpleasant insect that had crawled in from the street. His lip curled in a barely concealed sneer. "Julian," Marcus began, his voice dripping with condescension. While I admire your creative approach, perhaps we should leave the deep dive analytics to the people with doctorates in quantitative finance? Julian's gaze was glacial. Marcus, this is Alara. She is my new consultant on this matter. You will give her unrestricted access to all of Omnicorp's raw data streams. Is that understood? The room rippled with shock. Marcus's face tightened, his professional mask slipping to reveal a flash of raw fury. He saw this not as a strategy, but as a personal insult, a public declaration that he and his entire department had failed. He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. Alara was led to a terminal, the screen lighting up with a cascade of numbers so dense it made her dizzy. It was a tidal wave of information, a language she intuitively understood but had never been allowed to speak. For the first few hours, she was paralyzed by imposter syndrome, the voices of doubt screaming in her head. What was she doing here? This was a mistake. She was a cleaner, a data clerk, a nobody. The memory of her mother, frail and weary in a hospital bed, the endless stacks of bills on their small kitchen table, flashed in her mind. This wasn't just about a puzzle. It was about survival. It was about honoring the quiet fight her mother had endured. That thought steadied her. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she no longer saw numbers. She saw the symphony. She began to work, her focus absolute, tuning out the skeptical glances and whispered comments. The world outside her screen dissolved. There was only the data, the rhythm, the harmony, and the hunt for that single dissonant note. The days bled into nights. Alara worked with a feverish intensity, subsisting on vending machine coffee and a fierce, quiet determination. The boardroom became her world, the glowing screen her only landscape. The other analysts and executives kept their distance, treating her with a mixture of pity and contempt. But Julian was a constant presence. He wouldn't leave the office, either watching the markets, fielding angry calls from the board, and more often watching her. He started bringing her real coffee, not from the machine, but from a small cafe he liked miles away. He'd place it on her desk without a word. Then one night he pulled up a chair. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "When you look at that, what do you see?" She hesitated, then tried to explain. "I don't really read it," she said, her eyes still on the screen. "I feel it. It has a pulse. Most of it is steady, like a heartbeat. But this is different. It's hiding inside the heartbeat. It moves when the market moves, so it looks natural. But it's not. It's a parasite." He listened, completely captivated. Her descriptions were strange, metaphorical, yet they made more sense than any financial report he'd ever read. He found himself telling her about his father, a ruthless titan of industry who saw people as assets on a balance sheet. "He built this empire," Julian said, looking out the window at the city that bore his family's name on half its buildings. "But he never saw the beauty in it. He only saw the profit. I spent my whole life trying not to be him." Alara looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw past the Ice King persona. She saw a man burdened by a legacy, as trapped in his penthouse as she had been in her basement. "My mother," she said softly. "She couldn't leave the house for the last 5 years, but she saw more beauty in the single flower I'd bring her than most people see in a whole garden. It's not about what you have. It's about what you see." A connection formed in those quiet, late-night conversations, a fragile bridge between two vastly different worlds. He was drawn to her unvarnished integrity, a quality he had never encountered in his circle. She began to see the vulnerability beneath his cold exterior. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a man afraid of failing his own ideals. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite so alone. It was on the 5th night, deep in the pre-dawn hours when the city was a silent, sleeping giant, that she found it. The dissonant note she had been hunting finally resolved into a clear, identifiable melody. It wasn't just a market fluctuation. It wasn't a glitch. It was a ghost algorithm, a piece of code so sophisticated, so elegant, it was almost a work of art. It was designed to mimic the natural chaos of the market, but it was siphoning fractions of a cent from every single transaction, rerouting them through a labyrinth of shell corporations. It was also subtly manipulating the Omnicorp valuation data, making the company seem weaker than it was, driving down the price, making the merger look like a catastrophe. It was brilliant, methodical, and deliberately engineered sabotage. "I found it," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and excitement. Julian was by her side in an instant. She explained it to him, not in technical terms, but in her own language. "It's a parasite," she repeated, her finger tracing the malignant code on the screen. "It's been feeding on the company for months, but it's been starving the Omnicorp data, making it sick." The next morning, they presented her findings to the board. Marcus Vance was there, his face a mask of polite skepticism. As Alara spoke, outlining the algorithm's function, Marcus prepared his attack. The moment she finished, he pounced. "This is fascinating," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "A truly imaginative theory from our consultant. However, my team, a team of actual experts, has concluded that these are predictable server-side latencies, compounded by a volatile emerging market. What Miss, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name, is describing is a ghost story. A fantasy." He presented a series of complex charts and graphs that seemed to support his conclusion, overwhelming the board with jargon and data they barely understood. He painted Alara as an unstable, unqualified amateur, and Julian as a reckless fool for trusting her. The board members, already nervous, began to waver. They understood Marcus's language of profit and loss, of manageable risk. They did not understand Alara's language of heartbeats and parasites. The rival firm that had been circling the Omnicorp deal had just made a new offer, a lowball, predatory bid, but a safe exit. The board saw it as their only way out. They gave Julian an ultimatum. Get rid of the girl, cut their losses, and take the buyout, or they would vote to remove him as CEO. The weight of his father's legacy, of his entire world, came crashing down on him. He had to choose between the woman he was beginning to believe in and the empire he was sworn to protect. Alara refused to be dismissed. That night, as Julian wrestled with his impossible choice, she sat in the empty boardroom, staring at the code of the ghost algorithm. It wasn't just the function that bothered her. It was the structure, the style. Like a composer, the coder had a unique signature, a specific way of phrasing the logic. She had seen it before. A long time ago, during the endless nights she'd spent by her mother's bedside, she had read everything she could get her hands on, from medical journals to obscure academic papers on the internet. Her mind, a library of patterns, dredged up a memory, a paper she had read years ago. It was a theoretical treatise on financial chaos theory, written by a brilliant but disgraced university professor. She found the paper in a deep corner of the web. As she read it, a cold dread washed over her. The theoretical code he had outlined in the paper was the blueprint, the DNA of the ghost algorithm. It was the same signature, the same elegant, malevolent style. The professor's name was Alastair Chun. He had been a rising star until his career was abruptly destroyed 2 decades ago. She dug deeper, pulling up old news articles. Alastair Chun had been the original partner of the legendary founder of Thorn Industries, Julian's own father. The story was brutal and swift. Julian's father had used Alastair's theories to build his initial fortune, then ruthlessly cut him out, bankrupted him, and dragged his name through the mud, painting him as an unstable radical. Alastair Chun had lost everything. His career, his reputation, his will to live. He had died a broken man a few years later. The final piece of the puzzle, the most horrific and unthinkable piece, slammed into place. Alara ran a search for Alastair Chun's surviving family. A single result appeared: a son. A son who had changed his last name slightly, who had gone to law school, who had worked his way up with quiet brilliance and unimpeachable loyalty. A son who had positioned himself closer to the Thorn Empire than anyone else. She clicked on the image. The kind, weary face of David Chun, Julian's trusted lawyer, his oldest friend, the man who had been his rock through this entire crisis, stared back at her from the screen. She felt the air leave her lungs. The saboteur wasn't a rival. It wasn't a greedy opportunist like Marcus. It was the man standing right next to the king, whispering advice in his ear. She had to tell Julian. But the truth wouldn't just save his company. It would shatter his world. She found him in his office, staring down at the city, the weight of the board's ultimatum pressing down on him. She quietly closed the door. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we were wrong. It's not about the money." She laid it all out for him. The academic paper, the story of Alistair Chun, the ruthless betrayal by his own father. She watched his face as the pieces connected, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to a deep, hollowed-out horror. When she finally showed him the photograph of a young David Chun standing beside his father, Alistair, the ice around Julian Thorne didn't just crack. It vaporized. The betrayal was too immense, too intimate to comprehend. "No," he whispered. "Not David. Anyone but him." He summoned David to his office. When David entered, his expression was one of calm concern. "Julian, you look terrible. Did the board?" "My father destroyed him," Julian said, his voice flat and dead. "He destroyed your father." Alistair Chun. For a single, fleeting moment, David's mask of composure slipped. A flicker of something ancient and cold, pure, undiluted hatred, flashed in his eyes before being suppressed. He didn't deny it. He simply stood there, the silence stretching into an unbearable tautness. "He took everything from us?" David said finally, his voice devoid of all its previous warmth. It was the voice of a ghost. "My father was a genius. Your father was a thief. He built this empire on my father's mind, then threw him away like garbage. I watched it kill him. I watched my family fall apart. I have spent 20 years earning your trust, Julian. 20 years waiting for the perfect moment to take back what was stolen. Not the money. I don't want the money. I want the name. I want to see the name." Thorne turned to ash. "Marcus Vance," he explained, "was a useful fool. His greed and ambition made him the perfect cover, the obvious suspect." David had subtly fed Marcus information, fanning the flames of his ego, knowing he would claim any anomaly as a simple market fluctuation. "You were so busy looking for sharks, Julian," David said with a chilling calm. "You never saw the patient fisherman, waiting on the shore." The confession was not an emotional outburst. It was a final report, the closing of a ledger that had been open for 2 decades. He had won. The company was on the brink. Julian's reputation was in tatters, and the legacy he sought to protect was about to be sold for parts. David had orchestrated his revenge with the same cold, analytical precision that Julian's father had used to build his empire. In that moment, Julian Thorne was faced with a choice that defined not just his career, but his soul. He could expose David, but the scandal would be catastrophic. The story of his father's sins, the foundation of their wealth, would become public. The company would surely collapse. Or he could take the buyout, bury the truth, and save a piece of the empire, living forever with the knowledge of David's victory and his own cowardice. He looked at Alara, who stood silently by the window. He saw her integrity, her quiet strength, the clarity with which she saw the world. She hadn't just found a flaw in the code. She had shown him the flaw in his own. He had been so obsessed with his father's legacy of success that he had ignored his legacy of sin. That was the real echo. That was the real ghost in the machine. He knew what he had to do. He called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. He walked into that room a different man. The Ice King was gone. In his place was someone vulnerable, human, and resolute. He didn't begin with data or charts. He began with a story. "For my entire life," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I have been running from my father's shadow, trying to build a legacy of my own. I see now that I was running in the wrong direction. You cannot build a future until you have made peace with the past." He told them everything. He told them about Alistair Chun. He confessed his father's original sin, the rotten foundation upon which Thorne Industries was built. He laid bare David's brilliant, heartbreaking revenge. He exposed Marcus Vance not as a villain, but as an arrogant pawn in a much larger game. Then he turned to Alara. This company's brightest minds, its most expensive analysts, all of us were blind, he said, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. We were looking at the numbers, but we failed to see the truth. The only person who saw it was a woman no one else bothered to see at all. Her name is Alara Vance. She is not a consultant. She is the future of this company. Her integrity, her unique perception, is an asset more valuable than all our holdings combined, he concluded. You can vote to remove me. You can take the buyout and let this company die with a lie. Or you can stand with me, with her, and we can rebuild this place on a new foundation. Not of profit, but of truth. The silence that followed was absolute. He had staked everything not on a financial projection, but on a moral principle. He had offered them not a safe exit, but a difficult, honest future. Slowly, one by one, the board members, moved by his raw sincerity and the undeniable power of the story, nodded their assent. The company was saved. In the quiet aftermath, David Chun faced legal consequences, a silent, hollowed-out figure whose victory had turned to ash at the last moment. Marcus Vance was dismissed, his career ruined by his own hubris. The storm had passed. A few days later, Julian didn't summon Alara to his office. He met her at the small cafe where he'd been buying her coffee. The noise and bustle of the city felt a world away from the silent tension of the boardroom. He offered her a newly created position, Chief Strategy Analyst, a role designed around her unique talents, with a salary that would erase her debts and secure her future. She hesitated. I don't know if I belong in that world, Julian. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. It was the first time they had touched. The world needs to belong to people like you, Alara, not people like my father. You didn't just save my company, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. You saved me. From him. From becoming him. All my life I've been analyzing assets, and I never understood what a true asset was until I met you. He saw her, not as a tool or a prodigy, but as the woman who had shown him how to see. It wasn't a declaration of a boss to an employee. It was the confession of a man who had finally found his true north. She accepted the position, but on one condition. Her first act as Chief Strategy Analyst was to draft a proposal, funded by a significant portion of the company's profits, to create the Alastair Chin Foundation. Its mission was to provide grants to families crushed by medical debt, a quiet tribute to her mother, and a way to create a new, better legacy for the Thorn name. The final scene is not in a boardroom, but back in the penthouse. Alara and Julian stand side by side, looking out at the same city. But the view is different now. It is no longer a kingdom of cold, glittering diamonds, a symbol of isolation and power. It is a network of lights, of stories, of possibilities. It is a shared future. So I ask you again, what is the true value of a person? Perhaps it's not about what you have, but about what you see, the patterns you notice, the dissonant notes you are brave enough to question, the people you choose to lift up. Look around you right now. Who is the invisible person in your world? The cleaner, the clerk, the quiet one in the corner? And what hidden gift are you overlooking? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to read it.